I had been wedded to the woman who would become my beloved wife, and she had a younger sister who had a reputation for being daring and full of mischief, at least according to what I had always heard about her from my wife. My wife decided one day to introduce her sister to me and the rest of my family, and so she invited her sister to a gathering at my parents' house. The whole family got together to give her a warm welcome when she arrived. The manner in which my wife's sister conducted herself throughout the day took an unexpected turn. She made no secret of the fact that she was attracted to me and did not bat an eye when I asked her about her feelings. There were a few events that took place that set off alarm bells for me, such as when she asked me to dance with her during an event, and when I declined, she dragged me onto the dance floor with her. After that, she began stroking me in a suggestive manner, and after that, she also pressed herself against me. She purposefully presented herself to me in a manner that was inappropriate. I was at a loss to understand why my wife did not see through her sister's antics, especially considering how far off they were from anything that could be considered innocent. I reached a point when I was compelled to consider the possibility that she had been incorrectly presented to me. Rather than being mischievous in any way, she was shameless and lacked the ability to remain within her boundaries. I initially believed that it was her typical attitude, because that is what I had been informed. But as time went on, it became abundantly evident to me that she was not putting on any kind of act when she stated her affection for me, including my wife, in front of everyone. When I told my wife about her sister, at first she was taken aback by her sister's daring. However, she quickly shrugged it off as being nothing more than simple infatuation. My wife had the notion that she would outgrow it at some point, and that it was harmless in its inherent state. After all, I was the one who selected her, and the connection between us was strong. Time went by, and the natural progression of life continued. In order to finish her education, the sister of my wife came to live with us. As she adjusted to living in our house, I became increasingly apprehensive about the exchanges that would take place between me and her. When she moved in with us against my will, she seduced me a lot of times. But once again, my wife refused to acknowledge that fact. I was aware of the flirtatious glances and covert advances toward one another that were being made. Once more, I made the decision to discuss my worries with my irresponsible wife, since I was concerned about the potential issues that could occur. I approached the topic in a way that wasn't intimidating one evening as we were sitting on the porch, appreciating the refreshing wind. To forestall any potential misunderstandings and to keep our family life as peaceful as possible, I offered that we locate a reputable girls' hostel for my wife's sister to stay in. I had a secret wish that she would recognize my anxiety and agree with my choice, despite my reservations. My wife listened carefully, but at first, she was reluctant to admit the mounting animosity that existed between her sister and me. In spite of this, as I elaborated on my observations, a flutter of worry began to spread across her chest. She came to the conclusion that her sister's sentiments toward her were probably more than just a momentary crush. My wife approached her sister with some reluctance and started a conversation, during which she voiced her worries and emphasized the significance of preserving a healthy dynamic within the family. To my astonishment, my wife's sister grasped the seriousness of the issue almost immediately. She made an assurance that she would not offer any cause for fear and would respect the boundaries that my wife and I had established. As the days proceeded into weeks, the home eventually appeared to return to its previous state of peace. The trust my wife had in her sister was gradually regained, and life resumed its normal pace. It was a hot summer week, so we decided to spend our weekend in the pool. When my wife and I were getting ready to go into the pool, her sister appeared out of nowhere, wearing virtually nothing except a few threads of clothing. It was the way that she looked at me, barely noticeable, that caused me to lose control of my actions. However, my wife was so thoughtless and blind that she couldn't notice that her sister was trying to seduce me. And at the same time, I was getting drawn to her sister. It made me feel uneasy to see her wearing a tiny piece of cloth, so I went inside with the intention of bringing ice for the drinks. However, as soon as I set foot inside, I noticed that my body temperature had increased significantly. When I opened my refrigerator to get some cool air on my face, I thought that my wife had encircled me in her arms. However, the minute I drew her on, I stepped back to see my wife's sister standing so excessively near to me. However, she pulled me, and this time I kissed her, and then she continued with our kiss. My wife had no idea that behind closed doors, her sister and I were starting to get engaged in a web of emotions. She was completely oblivious to the situation. One day, while my wife was doing her normal things, she accidentally heard her sister and me talking quietly. She didn't think much of it at the time, because it seemed like a normal conversation between family members. But she had no idea that this seemingly harmless talk would have a big effect on how we felt about each other. Something changed in the evening, as the day came to an end and she thought about what had happened. She couldn't ignore an increasing feeling of unease. The talk she had heard earlier came up again, and she started to have doubts. We had worked hard to build trust between us, but it was starting to fall apart right in front of her eyes. As she became aware of the significance of the betrayal, tears began to fill up in her eyes. She experienced a range of feelings, including rage, despair, and severe despair. She demanded an explanation for what we had done. Our explanations fell on deaf ears, because deep down, she was aware that it is difficult to rebuild trust once it has been damaged. She arrived at a difficult choice while having a heavy heart. She severed the poisonous ties that had contaminated their relationship by requesting that her sister look for a new residence so that she would think about the two of us regarding our marriage. As I watched my wife's eyes fill with tears, I felt a deep sense of regret and realized how bad the mistake I'd made. I had clearly caused her pain and hurt, and I knew that what I had done was more than just a mistake in judgment. At that time, I begged her to give me another chance, hoping against hope that she would give me a chance to make up for what I had done. When I found out that my wife was leaving me, it was like a sudden jolt of truth. With her sister's exit, it seemed like the effects of my wrongdoings got worse, as if a harsh light had been shined on how bad they were. After resuming my relationship with my wife, I discussed the possibility of starting a family with her. She was open to the idea, so we began trying to conceive a child, but our efforts were unsuccessful. After 2 months of trying, my wife made an appointment with a gynecologist. I went with my wife for the initial visits, but then I got my promotion, and I had to cancel my company with her visiting gynecologist at the very last hour. Little did I realize that my last-minute bailout would flip my life upside down. After I left with my friends on a trip, we had to cut it short because of things that weren't in our plans. I didn't have time to tell my wife about the change in plans, so I ended up going home by myself. As soon as I walked in the front door, the house was eerie quiet, except for a series of strange sounds that caught my attention. I followed the sounds, which made me feel more and more uncomfortable because I was curious about what was going on. With every step, the groans got louder, rolling through the hallways and filling the air. The sound was definitely from a person, and it made me feel afraid and unsure. As I got closer to where the strange sounds were coming from, my suspicions about what was going on grew. When I walked into my bedroom, I noticed my wife and her gynecologist were lost in each other and having fun in the shower, and I also observed my wife enjoying the dominant side of their relationship. Our restroom had a glass door, which meant that if I could see them through the door, they could also see me. However, I was so stunned by what was happening in front of me that I lost my balance and fell over my study table. The fan, which had been kept on the table, fell off the table as I collapsed. As soon as the table fan fell to the ground, all of their attention was drawn to the outside, where I was standing perfectly still. When they spotted me standing there, they did the same thing. I was aware that she had seen me leave, and despite the fact that I was confused about how to respond to my wife's infidelity, I chose not to return home for some time. I made the decision to go to her sister, and as soon as I arrived there, I started kissing her because I was upset about my wife's treachery. When I kissed her, she kissed me back, and then we led ourselves into a scenario where going back was no longer an option. I ended up spending the night at its fullest with my wife's sister. I continued to do the same thing for several days, until one day I asked her what her fantasy was. And her response stunned me when she said that she fantasizes about being molested and manhandled by me. Her fantasy gave me an opportunity to exact both my wrath and my retribution all at once. I went to a lawyer and applied for a divorce, and within a few days, I had the papers in my hand. After that, I went back to my cheating wife, and before I confronted her about her treachery to me, she questioned why I had returned so soon, and she had the audacity to blame me for catching her enjoying the shower with another man. When I informed her that we had to cut short our trip because of an emergency, she did not believe me and began to make a commotion, claiming that I was lying and that I had been preparing to spy on her for a long time. Then I yelled because I was frustrated that one of my friends had been ill and that we were unable to leave him in the hotel while the rest of us went out and had fun. As a result, we cut the vacation short and agreed that we would fix the situation on our next trip. After a moment of silence, I pulled my wife to me and whispered, "I want to fun you up so badly that you'll always remember this day." We stared at each other for a moment. Afterward, I hurled the divorce papers across the room and started to leave when she grabbed my arm and prevented me from leaving, and asked me to listen to her for only 5 minutes. She voiced her amazement at my unforgiving disposition, implying that my response to her acts was harsher than she had intended it to be. She was perplexed by my seeming lack of curiosity over the reasons why she began a romantic relationship with her gynecologist, and she expressed her confusion to me. After that, she continued on with her doctor, who was confident in his masculinity, but keen on exploring the more submissive part of his personality. She said that the primary focus of their relationship was on sexual fulfillment and activity, by claiming that there was a lack of emotional connection in their bonding. She went on to say that her relationship with her doctor began on an impromptu basis when she learned about the disagreement that he had with his girlfriend over their respective sexual inclinations. She took the initiative in seducing him in a moment of impulsiveness, and from there they moved on with their relationship. She gave the impression that the physician was not a person for whom she held powerful emotional feelings. The only other person to whom she claims to have had an emotional attachment is the one who issued her divorce papers as a direct result of the actions she took. She even went so far as to tell me about the day that I walked in on them being intimate, how she saw me leaving and immediately stopped what she was doing, despite the fact that the trance had already been broken, and how she then asked the doctor to leave the house because she wanted to talk to me. My wife wanted to stay in our relationship so hard that she recommended that we have an open marriage, despite the fact that we had both cheated on each other. However, my dignity and pride never enabled me to do so. As a result, I told her that I would rather control my cravings than see my wife being touched by another man. She smiled at my response, maybe because she was not expecting this from me at that moment. After that, she started making out with me. I was repulsed and appalled by what she was doing, so I tried to get away from her, but I soon found myself kissing her again so that I could get my revenge. After a short while, we stripped off on our bed, and I then offered that we do something different, and I inquired as to whether or not she can trust me. She, for some reason, was feeling bad, but she eventually agreed with me and put her trust in me. I then proceeded to tape her mouth shut with a cloth and bound her hands, feet, and arms to the opposite sides of the couch. After that, I exited the room and left her with a multitude of unanswered questions. But when I returned to the room with her younger sister wearing a blindfold, I heightened the intensity of her curiosity, and I asked her once again about her fantasy. And this time, she answered in front of her sister, and my wife looked at me with big wide eyes, but she was powerless to do anything. After that, I began complying with all of the requests that her sister had made of me. I had no intention of acting in such a manner, but my wife had left me with no other option. I knew that when confronted with upsetting or unpleasant circumstances, she copes by closing her eyes. And this time, she closed her eyes when I started making out with her sister. But I have no doubt that what she overheard or saw involving me and her sister will have a significant effect on her, leaving an emotional scar that will last a lifetime and continue to have an effect on her long after the event that caused it. I anticipated that the most upsetting part for my wife was when I removed her sister's blindfold, and she saw my wife in the same room in which we had been physically intimate. However, after a few seconds, my wife's sister was able to get over her initial shock and resume with me in an act. I had no doubt that I had broken my wife's heart when I behaved so cruelly against her sister in front of her. My wife is very protective of her sister, and she is always looking out for her. But regardless of what took place that evening, my wife would be blamed for it. And I have to say that I have never once felt even the slightest bit of remorse about my decision, because I wished for her to experience the exact same emotions that I had on the day that I discovered her in the shower with her doctor. After that night, my wife's sister moved back into my house on my demand, and this time I made love to her in front of everyone. After my wife saw the change in our relationship and the shift in my mood, we spent hours talking, laughing, and doing things together. As my wife watched our growing relationship and realized that her husband had built a connection with her own sister, it caused an immense amount of emotional distress for her. She left the house, and then a few days later, she also ended our marriage, which was already in trouble. She started experiencing an array of feelings whenever she went back to her previous home. She sensed that her sister's happiness was negatively impacted by her presence. Nonetheless, she craved a connection with her sister. She was adamant that their sibling tie was unshakable, and she refused to acknowledge that their dynamic conflicts were having an effect on their closeness. She planned to pay a visit in the hopes of bridging the divide, and she was prepared to do so despite the possibility of encountering opposition or displeasure. Nevertheless, it was my action that caused the most damage to her emotions. My eyes, which were previously brimming with admiration, gazed at her as if her very presence was enough to suffocate me now. I would leave the room as soon as she walked in so that I wouldn't have to deal with or acknowledge her presence. I am certain that the anguish she felt as a result of my rejection was a persistent agony within her spirit as she worked hard to comprehend the breadth of our disagreement. Subscribe if you liked this video, and join if you want to get pro voiceover soon. Thank you for watching.